All right. So now we are here together for the second social discussion at this symposium, ATHS, and the journalists and other professionals were working during the break. Some were not available, but we're going to try to do, Patrick and myself. So this social discussion that is dedicated to the social debate that's going to talk about drug trafficking and drug policies between prohibition, legalization, and narcotrafficking or drug trafficking. What are the policies in order to answer to these complex and broad questions? We have a panel of very relevant people here, and I will start from left to right. Professor Massin in Lille is a specialist, well, an economy teacher in economics, professor in economics, and she just wrote a book with Professor Benlagda, who was with us during the previous symposium, to talk about narco trafficking, and she will give us an update. Then I won't present Ivana Obravik. She is used to coming to ATHS meetings and these discussions, and then I was told we're talking about addictive tendencies. Well, whatever the case, she is also going to present a comparison or the state of play of drugs in different countries and policies, a critical analysis of these different situations in terms of regulations. Bertrand, an old friend who had come through the humanitarian level, well, Bernard Kouchner rather, and no, to work on policies, a methadone, and he is a living encyclopedia. So not Bernard Kouchner, the last text and regulations, national, international regulation in terms of regulations and addictions. So we have a friend of the symposium from Panama, Javier Segredo, who comes from Spain originally, and he is the author and founder of the Laboratory of Global Innovation in Drug Policies and Sustainable Development. He will speak in order to remind us of the emergency in order to change things. Well, all of the nefarious drug policies. Maître Colette CAPDEVIELLE, who is a deputy of the Pyrénées-Atlantique, but she's a lawyer. And before being PM, a few decades ago, she had already come to one of the symposiums to talk about this very theme, and you are looking close at those themes because you involved for the PS group on the Bill of Law on narco trafficking, and also a report, and you will tell us about it. You're very interested in drug policies. And then Patrick Ebrard, whom I will give the floor to. He's a cardiologist, but it's not linked to cardiology, but it's a humanitarian commitment because he's one of the co-founders of Médecins du Monde, Médecins Sans Frontières, so Doctors Without Borders, Doctors of the World, and one of the co-founders of Harvard Society, and he worked on risk reductions and drug policies and has especially active in France when he was working with Bernard Kouchner to help change things and settle these methadone centers in a country that was very opposed to that. So In order to set the debate, these three presentations, about 15, 20 minutes, Ivana is going to open the session, and she's going to give us a comparative review of drug policies. Then you will speak to talk about the update on the state of play in narco-trafficking. And we, on the ground, look at this with a certain concern, the explosion of the use of cocaine. And Javier Sagredo will also talk about the impact of all of these drug policies on populations that are fragile in Latin America. And then we will start our discussion, and everyone can take part and give an analysis and proposals. Patrick, if you want to come first and take the floor. Thank you very much, Jean-Pierre. Thank you for having organized this symposium with all your great team, organizing this congress, to which I take part in every year with great pleasure since the very beginning, which means since Saint-Tropez, 1992. 1992. And thus, to tell you about the history, Bertrand will add information. He is one of my fighting buddies, and this discussion, this debate is articulating between prohibition, legalization, and drug trafficking. We are going to talk about everything, and as Jean-Pierre said, we have experts here. I think that in these troubled times, in which sometimes we feel a certain populism arising, this type of meeting is important. And in the presentation of this symposium, there was a quote from the Enlightenment period: defending science is defending freedom and human dignity, because where reason feigns obscurantism and tyranny settle. I think this is a way to present things for us who fight for health and people's health, and this is perfectly well adapted to our discussion. This discussion, or obviously what has been done in Biarritz for many years with everything we need to help drug users, these structures could be threatened. And we believe that policies in France on reducing risk is a well-developed policy. It could disappear very quickly as well. So I believe that we must absolutely try to protect what has been done. And this is what we are going now to take a look at. I will therefore give the floor immediately to Ivana Obradovic. Thank you very much. Obranovic, sorry. Thank you for these words of introduction and the invitation to this beautiful symposium. I'm going to start with brushing the horizon and looking at drugs not on the global level, but because, as I will mention, there are differences that are more and more increased between policies in different countries, but a focus rather on regulatory policies in cannabis that have appeared with a few elements. We can already take stock to this stage. And a word first on the context. Alexis Gouzil reminded us yesterday that the epidemiologic observations in Europe for 10 years are surprising. There's a reconfiguration of consumption and drugs in Europe, which are observed also in France, with a massive withdrawal of tobacco consumption, but an increase of cannabis for adults, but a decrease when it comes to teenagers, which means that contrarily to what we often believe, and for 10 years, the cannabis consumption is decreasing when it comes to young people, teenagers, and psychostimulants, cocaine. and MDMA for adults is growing. It's not just for teenagers, and we see an increase of synthetic drugs as well. And in terms of momentum, we see a momentum of vaping, and this is the case for young people. The second important change is that the drug offer is renewed constantly with a very strong reactivity of traffickers in their way they take action, the circuits of production and trafficking. And there are record production in psychostimulants. We are more than 3,000 tons of cocaine produced in 3 countries of America, Latin America, Bolivia and Colombia and another, and there have been seizures of these. This offer is renewed in a very dynamic manner. And then another element of this background, the increase of chemical drug precursors, products who are legally used in the industry, in the textile industry, in the fragrance industry, for example, but are changed. So for acetone, ephedrine, and new sectors for drugs that are developing. The third important part for public policies that are diversifying on the global scale with an approach that is less monolithic in drugs. Until 2010, there was an international consensus around the idea that we needed to have prohibition. But then since 2010, we had first initiatives to regulate cannabis that I'm going to talk in a minute. And thus today we have a whole array that is diversified of these drug policies between prohibition, legalization / regulation, since it is a word that is often used in different ways, and I'll come back to that as well. There are differences in the way we need to envisage regulation on the American continent and in Europe. So, to cover the initiatives of regulations in cannabis, I'm going to start with a few steps back with a timeline of what happened since 2012 and the referendum that legalized cannabis for recreational use, so non-medical, as in Colorado and Washington, the first 2 states in the world to take the leap, and followed by half of the American states with an increase, a ramping up in 2018. Between 2018 and 2023, we had at least 1 new state legalizing cannabis for recreational use. And we see that since 2023, this momentum has stopped or maybe slowed down. The future will tell. So obviously what we need to mention is that all of these regulatory initiatives are done against the federal prohibition that persists on the production and consumption of cannabis on the American territory. Other countries have done the same. Uruguay was this first, and then Canada in 2018. In both cases, this was an initiative that was supported on the governmental level. In Canada, it was even an electoral promise. More recently, in the EU, a few countries are attempting to legalize cannabis. This was the case of Malta, and then Luxembourg, and then finally Germany. And there are ongoing discussions in the Czech Republic, but with recent legislative elections, it could be questioned again. And then finally, within the European space, local experiences that are underway in Switzerland and Belgium, I think. So there are 50 nuances of green, as you can see, with different policies around cannabis. Those that authorize it for recreational means, but medical means in a relatively broad way. Those who use it only or authorize it only for medical use and limit to several limited varieties in terms of THC quantities, and then or levels, and then some states that resist and do not authorize recreational or medical cannabis. In Canada, the reform on the federal level in 2018 that has 13 different models for the distribution and selling of cannabis, retail sale. So we see that there's a strong difference, first in the age groups, legal age to access cannabis. Legally, it goes from 18 years to 21 years, depending on the provinces. 21, it's in Quebec. It's the most stringent policy. And around the world, even if we could mention Uruguay. So we have distribution models and selling cannabis. We have a great diversity with the majority of provinces that privilege a model that relies on private operators. A few provinces, especially Quebec and what we call the maritime provinces or sea provinces with the little cart, the black cart, which privileges a public model, and then hybrid models that are quite original in the world today with public and private operators. It's the case of British Columbia. And finally, in Uruguay, a model we can qualify of stately because the state keeps a strong control, very tight control on the circulation of legal cannabis. There are three ways of supply for consumers. You need to decide for one of them. You cannot choose all three. You can get your supply in a pharmacy for 10 grams per week, not more, either through planting and growing at home, but with a limited number of plants, or through membership of a cannabis social club. The specificity of the model in Uruguay, you need to subscribe to a repository of consumers, and they have a past of a military dictature, so that means a number of consumers remain on the illegal market for that reason. And the state is involved in the production also, more in other jurisdictions where cannabis was legalized by authorizing very few companies to produce. At the first, in the beginning, it was national companies and then open to others. Today, there are 5 companies only that are accepted to do so. I'll come back to the details of the offer because this is one of the interested indicators and that highlights the diversity. The first thing we need to say the promises behind these promises to legalize, to kill the black market or weaken these criminal networks, protecting minors also. So the second objective is to protect minors and limiting their exposition to cannabis. Third aim, reducing risk linked to consumption by authorizing the purchasing of cannabis legally produced to adults and promoting public health, promoting prevention and better controlling products. Also, in the end, being to allocate part of the taxes generated by sales for prevention and healthcare. So this means, well, the cannabis business to be legalized in a closed circuit, and the industrialization and environmental effects. I will come back to that later. There are few convergences and disparities, but roughly what came up is the difficulty of an adjusting between offer and demand, and each time we have a gap that is important between offer and demand. And what we see in a cross-cutting way is the pursuit of a decrease in consumption of minors when it was decreasing. And there is a small specificity in Uruguay where the consumption of youth was increasing and regulations didn't choose anything. It still increased, but in countries where it was already decreasing, there wasn't any inflation or increase, but an increase of consumption of cannabis in adults, especially after 35 years of age. And this is true for all jurisdictions. The other obvious effects is people in jail. and more generally in legal pursuits and minor infraction crimes. These are the other convergence in models that appeared in the continent. There's no moving back, in fact. Very few messages to come back on this reform. And finally, going backwards on everything that happened since this last decade. There are differences, and the illegal market is reduced, but it's more or less quick, depending on the different models, and a contrast between cannabis in the United States and the distribution in a closed circuit that we could see in some European countries, and then an industrialization of the cannabis sector on the American continent with environmental effects that are being denounced. So for Uruguay or North America, legalization. What about the European legalization that is tighter, as we see in the 3 countries that have not legalized the entire circuit of production and sales, but authorizes the personal use, growing at home, but this all in a closed circuit. It's the case of Malta, as you can see, for private use, self-culture, cannabis social club authorized in Malta and Germany, but not in Luxembourg. Each time there are thresholds that are relatively limiting and that help to offer a very careful regulation with an assessment at each step of the deployment. The implementation of the legalization of cannabis as practiced in these European countries is ready at the crossroads today, because with the different political evolutions and changes in the different European countries. In Malta, for example, we have a recriminalization with a new law that was adopted a few months ago, opens up a whole registry of consumers and creating a new crime for a nuisance of cannabis. And we see that there's a backlash in Malta on this reform to legalize. In the same way, in Luxembourg, people are angry about medical cannabis, and new measures are starting to offer less varieties of cannabis in less open conditions. And in the same way, in Germany, with the different policies and politicians' uncertainties about legalization for recreative and as well as for the medical cannabis, to stop this spread of online prescriptions where cannabis was important, and this is a big political question. So we have almost seen a counter-reform currently, with the idea that regulation would have been taken the wrong way. It wouldn't have proven its righteousness, and maybe we could wonder if what helped these reforms in legalization, having governments of coalition with socio-democrats, liberals, ecologists, and just it's backlashing against these reforms, because after a first political change, the reforms are questioned. The other point in this counter-reform, what we can see in this distribution models that are non-commercial and shown as a third path, an alternative to cannabis as in America, a resilience, an important resilience of the black market and legal circuits who have difficulties to impose themselves, maybe because they were limited.
Let me finish with these local experiences in the Netherlands and in Switzerland. In the Netherlands, it's about this problem with these coffee shops that are authorized since the 70s in the Netherlands, but they're supplied with illegal cannabis. So there's a circuit of legal production in cannabis that has been developed in 10 different municipalities in order to supply 80 coffee shops. And so there's this experience, and for certain amount of time. And then in Switzerland, there's also some pilot projects in different cities with limited period of time and with a variation. So what's interesting about this model is that it's very diversified, and sometimes cannabis is sold in pharmacies or by private operators. So it's a way to change the distribution of cannabis. So we're witnessing a diversification of legalization schemes for cannabis for non-medical use. We have different economic models and different regulation choices. Also, reforms that are quite alternative in Europe to what has been done in the Americas. And actually, these reforms are inspired by governments, by coalition programs. But the idea or the issue here is to make these new regulations persist in time. And sometimes, of course, the results of the evaluations are not always those expected, and then a counter reform needs to be proposed. And finally, the Czech Republic has an interesting example because a project was approved by the National Assembly to legalize possession and culture of cannabis in the Czech Republic. At the end of the years 2000, it had been depenalized, even though certain issues came up with a new government that appeared, and I would privilege conservative parties that are hostile to a reform of cannabis. So I guess that the coming months will be decisive in this regard. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Ivana. I'm going to give the floor to Professor Sophie MASSIN, who's going to tell us about the economic repercussions of drug trafficking. Thank you. It's the first time that I was invited here. I'm an economist at the University of Lille, and I've been working with some colleagues that you know already. And I'm going to talk about the social cost of illegal drugs, what is measured and what is not. I'm going to tell you about the concept of social cost and the limits of this social cost when we apply this to illegal drugs. So first of all, I'm going to introduce the size of illegal drug markets, because we have been making a study to try to measure the size of illegal drug markets. And then I'm going to give you some elements, and tomorrow I will develop that in another session. And then I'll tell you about the social cost of drugs, what is measured, what is not measured. And actually, what is not measured is the intangible costs of drug trafficking. I'll give you some examples of that. And then conclusion, then I will conclude about the kind of implications for public policies. So first of all, about the size of illegal drug markets in France. Now, the source of this is a study that I made with Christian Benlagdar, and it's a study funded by Medeka. And the idea, well, the issue here is that the study is not yet disseminated. That's why I am not showing all the figures in the slides, because I don't want to disseminate things, but I will tell you this orally. So, first element, if we want to estimate the size of the illegal drug market in France for all products, actually, we're talking about 7 billion. And well, this is not mentioned in the slide, I'm just telling you. And just as a comparison, this is just like the GDP of South Sudan, which is not a very rich country, but it's the equivalent of the GDP of this country. And another comparison or reference for comparison is the turnover of self-entrepreneurs in France for 3 months. Now, compared to other kinds of drugs like cigarettes and alcohol, we have this graph. So that shows what illegal drugs represent in comparison to tobacco and alcohol. And now, if we think about the amount per product, we see that cocaine and cannabis are the two largest products that represent this turnover. It represents 80% of the illegal drugs market. I'll give you more information tomorrow, in the session tomorrow. So, when we think about what this represents in terms of euros, in terms of turnover, what's interesting for economists is to know the impact in society. So, economists have developed an indicator which is called the social cost. And according to the latest estimations in France in 2019, even though it was published in 2023, actually, this comes from a report. And this is an exercise that relies on many conventions. I mean by this that there is not an obvious way to calculate this social cost. I mean, nobody has agreed upon how to calculate, even though, well, if we all calculate this in the same thing, and if we do it in a repetitive manner, we can make comparisons. However, this is just to tell you that the social cost has certain limits in terms of its method. I'm going to give you some estimations. So the social cost of drugs encompasses the cost of the consequences of drugs for society. There's a table that synthesizes these results, and it is made up of two different parts. The external cost, that encompasses the costs for drug users, the non-intentional cost for drug users. So, because sometimes, well, drug users are not rational when they're using drugs. So this encompasses certain costs. And then there's a second block, which is the impact in the well-being of the variation of public finances. In other ways, how drug consumption influences in a positive or negative way on public finances. And so we're actually talking about the cost for society. And then a way to interpret the amounts that are going to be mentioned is to say, well, if drugs did not exist, we would have this money to do other things with it. So these are the estimations. As I said, it's data from 2019, and this model has been implemented for drugs, alcohol, and cigarettes. So we have these two blocks. The external cost, as I said, which encompasses the cost of lost lives or premature deaths, the cost of the loss of quality of life because of the diseases, losses of production or absenteeism, and then the cost as well for public finances, the cost of treatment, cost of prevention programs, and then the economies for or the savings for in terms of pensions, because this loss of lives means less pensions. So we have the social cost, which is 102 billion for tobacco, and then you have seen the figures actually for the other drugs. Now, this is the representation as well of this cost for tobacco, alcohol, and illegal drugs. And according to this graph, the cost of illegal drugs, the social cost of illegal drugs, as you can see in the picture, is not so important. If we compare it with the turnover, it means that social cost of tobacco is 8 times higher than that of illegal drugs, and for alcohol it is 3 times higher. And my the second point of my presentation is that, well, maybe the cost of illegal drugs is not so important, as I said, but this is related to the way that we have calculated the social cost. So actually, in the methodology, we have to bear in mind something that seems very important. The perimeter of this study is related mainly to the tangible costs, so costs that are measured in euro. There are certain costs that are intangible, they're more subjective, they're more difficult to convert into euros, like the loss of quality of life for sick people. This is taken into account, but not in an accurate manner. There's also another cost, which is psychological suffering, which cannot be estimated in the analysis. And on top of this, I would like to add that for the whole illegal drugs, there are intangible costs that are very important, and they are not included in the estimations that I've shown. So these intangible costs are actually the fact that narco trafficking is existing, and this is a burden for society. It's going to disrupt the way society evolves. So this is actually a track that I would like to explore. So before moving on to the negative aspects of drug trafficking, I would like us to reflect on the fact that drug traders, are they entrepreneurs as any other entrepreneur? In a certain way for their activity, yes, they are. They are just like a legal entrepreneur in terms of the way they manage the resources, the techniques of commercialization, for example, their organizational structure. When we think about the structures of networks, we see that there's a gradually more important specialization. There's also the externalization of certain functions. So in this regard, drug traders function like any other company, like any other business. We find the same kind of reflections. Right. Christian has proposed a graph. This is a chart of a drug traffic network. And here we have just represented the different functions, the different actors. And this is just to say that it just looks like a corporate chart of a legal business. So in terms of the structure of the organization, we find many common points with that of a legal corporation. And also, historically, there was the trend to recruit people that were close to the network. Now we're going to find people from social media. For example, here you find an app, we want a dealer for the night, on weekdays, and so on and so on and so forth. Now, in terms of logistics, for example, there's a home delivery that has been developed, and we find exactly the same problems as for any legal company. And marketing, we find lots of examples as well. There's the implementation of techniques that are effective and that are used by legal companies. So this is, for example, a menu of what is being proposed. It's a little bit, handmade, but yeah, you can find this. There's also a fidelity card with all the stamps. There's the packaging that imitates a legal product. And there are this kind of also offers and promotions. This is what you find in legal companies. So actually, the conditions are adapted to the clientele. So we have entrepreneurs that are very performant, as in many other in other legal markets. However, this is a threat for the social contract. And the threat, the most obvious threat, is that because they are in an illicit framework, they have to resort to violence in order to solve conflicts. And here we have some figures, for example, 110 deaths related to drug trafficking. I have to say that there are more deaths, of course, related to alcohol and smoking, but drug trafficking has also all these deaths that are related. And also there are collateral victims. There are deaths of people who are not dealers or users, but they die because of this drug trafficking. And a second example is the fact that dealers want to replace public services to buy social peace. And they may post these ads because they are aware that they're being a little bit of a burden for the neighborhood, for example, and then they say, yeah, we do help people and we are going to give you, for example, school supplies for your children. Also, there's a the vulnerability of the state because of corruption. Corruption exists because of this drug trade. And there's a report that estimates the cost of corruption actually related to drug trafficking and to drug use. And actually, the trends are not very promising because, according to this source, to Transparency International, the trend of corruption is undergoing a good dynamic. And the last point is the creation of noxious dynamics with intergenerational transmission. And here I'm referring to an article that was published in Economy publication in 2022 that showed that children who were exposed to illegal work, to illegal labor here in France, here we're talking about coca production in Peru. And well, these children who were exposed to coke production in a legal regime versus an illegal regime, well, those who were exposed in an illegal regime were more likely to become criminals or to commit crime in the future. In other words, they acquire social capital that is related to criminality, so it creates a dynamic that is not very favorable. So my conclusion, I'm going to go back to drug trafficking and the social cost of all these drugs. Now, illegal drugs, according to what has been measured in the study, we're just measuring one part of the social cost. So I think that the conclusion is a little bit provisional for the moment. So to conclude, what can we say in terms of public policies? Well, the Home Ministry has provided a response. We need to intensify the fight against drug trafficking. There's the slogan in front of the threat, respond. This is the slogan at the Home Affairs Ministry. And so far, there are very little signs of effectiveness of such a policy because prices are not getting higher, the use is not getting lower, and the problems associated to this are not getting lower either. So, well, this is just a very open issue, and I just invite you to reflect upon it and to develop a discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sophie Massin. I will give the floor to Bertrand Lebovich. Hello, good evening. I haven't prepared any PowerPoint. I have one for tomorrow, but I didn't know I was supposed to prepare one for today. Well, I will try to tell you what happened in the field of risk reduction vis-à-vis the prohibition of drugs, the global regime, the RGPD, and what happened about legalizing. 30 years ago, those in favor of risk reduction were extremely prudent about prohibition. The main reason was that they knew the accusation that had been set in the States, according to which risk reduction was the base, the cheval de Troie of legalization, and this would have weakened the movement. There was a question on which we always agreed upon. It was the criminalization of use, which seemed to us an obstacle to access to care. On other hand, it made an efficient prevention difficult, and in addition, even though at that time this argument was not strong nor heard, but it plays an important role today. Illicit drug users do not have the choice. Some drugs are forbidden and they need to turn themselves to the clandestine market. But very recently, last year, the Commission of Stupéfiants of the United Nations gathered in Vienna. They validated the expression harm reduction. It is a bit late if we think that this is over decades. One reason was that harm reduction was the baseline of legalization. There was another one which was more Machiavellic. If we want drugs to stay, to remain forbidden, increasing their dangerosity might be a good thing. And from this point of view, harm reduction was a bad solution, a bad idea. In any case, in 2024, for the first time, harm reduction was accepted by the Commission of Stupéfiants of United Nations. Now, harm reduction in France as well as in other countries, it is becoming much more anti-prohibitionist as it was the last decades. Pierre Chapard and Fabienne Pourchon explained to us that they were in favor of harm reduction, anti-prohibitionist. There are many reasons, but two main reasons. The first one being that the narrative today of the French state about use states the cannabis users that smoke on the weekends, they have meaning, they make sense. But if there was no traffic, Uburois, the writer, said, if there were no Poland, there will be no Polish people. That means that users are the main responsibles of this situation. If they didn't exist, the traffic wouldn't exist either. There is a long anti-prohibitionist tradition. It has been minority, but it exists. Within these arguments, with an extremely important element, it was that there were two negative externalities, that was violence on one hand and corruption on the other. However, these negative externalities, well, they bloomed these last years. I will give you an example. It is the example of cocaine. The North American market is saturated, and criminal groups have started to bloom also in Europe, where there are consumers, where there's money, and most of European harbors, in particular Antwerp, they have received huge amounts of cocaine. And not only this, because criminal groups also exported their methods, hyperviolence, the fact of recruiting young killers with no criminal records, sometimes on internet, a massive use of corruption, which augments now in Europe. There are many indicators that prove this. It increases in the harbors and amongst the police, amongst the lawyers, amongst the administration, which poses a huge problem to these democratic societies. Then what should happen at the UN? Because the three conventions, the one of 61, the one of 71 on synthesis drugs, and the one of 88 about precursors and traffic, is the law of humanity. This law has been a bit modified, and in both cases it is quite important. The first one vis-à-vis the Commission on Narcotic Drugs, which last year accepted the expression harm reduction. The second one dates from 2020. It was a bit amended as for the status of cannabis, so that the therapeutical cannabis is made legal, prohibiting the cannabis for leisure use. What can we expect from the future from UN and the Commission of Narcotics? The first one is that psychedelic that are dangerous substances with no therapeutical interest, that psychedelic are reclassified so that their therapeutical use would become legal. This would have interesting consequences, beginning by the price of substances in clinical trials. Well, it would be progress. A second item is very important, the legalization of coca sheet. I cannot get into too many details, but I think Ivana mentioned the history of cocaine is very particular. There are three producers, Peru, Bolivia, and Colombia, but there could be more. The beginning of 20th century in the Java colony, the Flemish made coca trees grow, and in 1910 they represented a quarter of the legal business of cocaine in the world. Afterwards it would decrease. I wouldn't be surprised that very soon in other places than the Andean countries there would be productions of cocaine trees, and therefore of cocaine. There are some people who have already required modifications. In February 2025, Colombian President Gustavo Petro was urging for the legalization of cocaine at a worldwide scale. In China, they required the Office Fédéral de Santé Publique to examine a project for the distribution of cocaine. And in Amsterdam, the mayor is pleading for programs of prescription of cocaine. I will devote 2 minutes to the prescription of cocaine. You might know that the Swiss decision of the prescription program about medical heroin of 92 was preceded by a remarkable work done by Annie Minot on all the programs that took place and consisted on prescribing morphine or heroin. Which were the findings? Well, some were real failures, but others worked well. And then this idea according to which heroin prescription was something that didn't work was questioned again by this report. I think that today we should find an animino that would publish a report, a paper on the programs for prescribing cocaine. Tomorrow I will co-chair a session with a great one in risk addictology, drug addictology, John Strong, with Mikhail Gosok. He wrote a book about the British system, and within the frame of this British system that started to work from the Rollstone Commission that still exist. Well, there were some prescriptions of cocaine. It seems when one read the several pages that was up and strong devoted to this prescription of cocaine, they seem to say that when doctors stopped prescribing cocaine, there were no huge withdrawals like with opium, and they considered that in fact that it was not worth to continue. I would like to read a very brief quote, which is the following one. If Colombia doesn't destroy the fields, the crops of drugs, the United States will do it on the place, and it will not be nice. It is the Donald Trump who explains that. Recently, Le Monde devoted 2 pages on this report, this relation between North America and South America. You will stop me, please, when... okay, still 2 minutes. Okay, perfect. So, Etana del Man, he says, prohibition, legalization, it is not reasonable. There are two positions. On the side of the prohibition, there is the war, the struggle against the drug, and the progressive prohibition. It is the one that has set up in European countries that accept harm reduction. And on the side of legalization, there are two positions. There is one which is ultra-liberal of the supermarket of drugs. And there is another position which is the one of controlled legalization, as Francisca Valero said, the pragmatic one that want to deconstruct progressively prohibition. Legalization of cannabis is a crucial, a critical question for several reasons, but there is one which is absolutely core. Before legalization of cannabis, Egypt in 1925 was asking the Marijuana Act of 37 that prohibited the cannabis with all this period of river madness. You took a puff of cannabis and you were in the arms of the sexual disorder. Yeah, it makes a laugh today, but well, I lost a bit my thread of my speech. Well, oh yes, until Pepe Mujica, the former guerrillero, made the decision to legalize, cannabis in Uruguay, and you could answer to the prohibitionists that they were dreamers, that they would imagine impossible things, and that prohibition was état de nature, the vocation of which was to exist forever. We can't say this anymore because some countries have legalized cannabis, and I will stop on that. There is a situation about cocaine which will probably oblige to discussion. You know that since a long time ago, Some people say the soft drugs don't exist. If we talk of legalizing cocaine, they will say it's hard drugs. But we need to accept that cannabis is a soft drug. Well, that's contradictory, but there is a troubling thing that all the economists of drugs know is that cocaine intakes have become absolutely giant, and the price of cocaine is decreasing in Europe, and quality, purity of cocaine is increasing. If prohibition of cocaine today is an absolute failure, violence linked to cocaine trafficking is ravaging, is demolishing Southern America. Recently, the president of Peru was dismissed by parliament due to the problems of and safety, which are in part linked to cocaine trafficking. I am not saying that you have to distribute cocaine in the supermarkets, but I think that negative externalities of this politic are that massive. The failure is so big that we will need to do something. Cocaine has become the worldwide merchandise, worldwide product. It is good for work, for parties, and for sex. So, a priori, it is the drug of the beginning of the 21st century with a huge future ahead. In the case of prohibition, it is a threat to democracy. That's why I am anti-prohibitionist. Thank you. Thank you, Bertrand. You've seen a short example, but we will come to it. But okay, perfect. Well, Javier,
It is a great pleasure to be with you again, and I thank the organizers for the invitation. And we were here in 2015. We had published a keynote, a document, an interesting document that broadens the international reflection on policies and drugs and the results in sustainable development. It was important for Latin America. This is why I wanted here to give additional information. And of course, I apologize for the accent in French. As the singer, Selena Cruz, said, my French is not very good looking. So I'm going to try in any case. We need to make the effort here in Biarritz. So I'm going to add information that is important. First, I think that we need to resize the concept of risk reduction. And there's a whole movement in Latin America that talks about risk reduction and having a broader meaning that is amplified. And they're saying that what are the real approaches of drug policies in society? This links us to what you presented previously on the level of costs, drug costs on the social level. And this is where we have focused a great many efforts in the last years to have these cost elements added that are usually not assessed by institutions, and also in the drug costs in many countries, the cost of the application of policies is stronger than the very issues, the very drug issues. So this is my point number one. The other one is that the black market is treated usually, well, if it appears in an autonomous way, we see it's a result from the policies, from the prohibitionist map, and we really need to increase the costs so that all the actors in this black market have we can protect our rights, our well-being. Let's now look at fears and polarization that is exacerbated with a rationale of tyrants. We saw this very much around the world with tyrants. Tolerance, solidarity, or social justice that we have so many difficulties in promoting. And when it comes to these policies, this current picture reminds us that we are still not there where we would like to be, and that it is false to think that we could be able to fight against fascism after the wars, the dictatures, and repression. What appears today is a beginning of an Alzheimer or a collective of forgetting, where what appears in the political debate is the person who can prevail and raises the values as absolute values in this context. And more than ever, I think drug policies, it's not about the bad queen as in Snow White, but we need to really look at the situation clearly. People who want to moralize and ask to burn the witches, we need to change this. And people have brilliant speeches on the topic, but there's a sort of a paralyzing of a number of people, families, communities that are trapped in the meanders of this drug momentum and no policies to face. The result is that it's zero inefficiency, as we mentioned, and a lot of toxicity, especially when it's about generating effects on the poor populations without rights and at the mercy of mafia and being penalized by the majority parties that continue to defend that this policy mustn't be discussed, changed, regulated, because it would be irresponsible to do so by closing their eyes on the terrible consequences of this, consequences inside and outside our countries. These policies are the clear reflection of social imagination it relies on. It is where these public policies should highlight and invest on attention, caregiving, instead of not using it in dehumanizing aspects. Narco trafficking and money laundering. We know that only 1%. This is something that general taxes, well, they recognize. We collect only 1% of the benefits in drugs, and so this is very different from most of the companies, legal companies, except for the revolutionary tax. If we add to that a number of details and the position of the American government to move backwards 20 years by getting rid of the obligation on the real property on companies and the free circulation, and being hard with the rich or hard with the, weak. There's a tax coldness. Apologies, but the gentleman is reading full speed a speech that is written and that we didn't get previously. It's hard to fight against corruption linked to narco trafficking, and then policemen, when they need to support childhood to maintain this prohibition of drugs. During this period, the official speech is the same. It's an isolated case. It's the rotten apple, whereas corruption continues everywhere in Europe. The list is long. There are multiple cases that we have seen in our geographies. The situation is more and more complicated. In the south of Spain, we see this, different killings in France, Sweden, Germany, and elsewhere. This is it's a essentially police and legal response. It's an impossible work. The sound is very bad as well. It keeps changing. Apologies from the interpreter. In the zones touched, there's a complexity of the different topics. The mayor of the Línea de la Concepción in south of Spain, Franco, said that we should maybe envisage legalizing marijuana, and that of the mayor in Amsterdam, already quoted, who convened a year ago a conference in order to explore new solutions to fight against drug and violence linked to this narco-trafficking and the lack of regulations around cocaine that are necessary to better manage the situation, and came out a manifesto to fight against drug with an integrated approach for public health, human rights, social justice, and security. It is very sad for us to see that in many European countries, Spain included, they were present at the conference and only addressed to part of the problem where we are overwhelmed. Our official answer to drugs has been fed for many years of complacence, with the different reactions that we saw since the crisis in the 80s, and we continue to sell in different latitudes, especially in Latin America, and we look without sympathizing. It's rather being defiantly at the regulations that have come more than a decade in some countries. An opportunity, unfortunately, missed for an international cooperation in these areas with the help of Latin American partners and European partners could have encouraged and supported an important debate on the global and regional level, crucial for the regions in our countries. And the worst part is that this seems sufficient. In practice, we have progressively gone to these legalization and confiscatory schemes. Now I'm going to talk about Spain by the bias of a controversial law on citizens' safety, which increased our deficit through social discipline. 65% of more than 500,000 of fines due to consumption or drug use or possession, namely cannabis, and is repressive. It's 839,000 euros, thus 300 million more than the total value of goods and money seized in traffickers in 22 years, from 2022 to 2023. It is about a real attack to tax ends and not an efficient answer to this drug issue. This shows clearly where the priorities are for our politicians in terms of drugs. It's an economic fine. It is an economic weight that is 4 times more severe on consumers and narcos. Is it time to talk about it, change things, innovate? Do you have any serious ideas to open up new perspectives on new European strategies that start being discussed? And the answer provided by the social and sanitary entities in different countries is very low. There are budgetary cuts that are felt in the national regional budgets that oblige civil society organizations to do their best to provide an insufficient answer to the worrying situation in Europe. And as they already said, this their aims attempt to control offer and decrease the demand or the supply and offer. So the prices that are more affordable, they want. And for public authorities, a movement that I would call interventionist as the tendency to work on problems in a systematic way through limited interventions that are insufficient or not adequate to resolve the issue. And they require changes, whereas nothing is changing. Facing this picture of the market generated by the supply and demand, the debates in many countries in Europe is suffocated and adulterated, institutional, or everybody is corrupted, and nothing is activated. Even when talking about human rights or development, subjects that we talk about but are uneasy sometimes to talk about are vanished from these budgets. It's difficult to be clearer to show that the reform in policies and drugs is necessary and urgent. We are attached in all countries, even those who voted for these reforms, to fight against drugs on the national, global level. But there's these lack of laws against fentanyl at the customs, etc., and in the ships in the Caribbean. We would need costly programs and public funds for, those have been spent inefficiently, and there's a responsibility of repression in a number of South American countries. In the end, I think it's important to change this movement, to call for this movement for a reform, to innovate. And what we have seen with a close interest, a document that was published by the Agency of United Nations for Development in relation with this connection of drug policies for development. They just published on the commitment, the brave commitment on innovation and deep reflections, not on the question of knowing whether it's important to regulate or not, but essentially on the way to have reforms and avoid a bad management of the drug market with a new knowledge and fairness between licit and illicit market, and having an approach founded on sustainable development. I recommend warmly the reading of this document. This discussion now will enable us to see it all. I would like to talk about innovation during the debate, please. Thank you very much, Javier. Thank you very much. So, to start the discussion, who would like to react?
Thank you for having invited me. It's an honor to be here among so many specialists. We have worked at the National Assembly in two different ways regarding this issue. Well, first of all, there was the drug trafficking law, which was one of the most voted. I mean, it was voted by unanimity in the Senate and almost unanimity at the National Assembly. It's a piece of legislation with new measures, but at the same time, in March 2025, we voted and we validated the conclusions of a parliamentary report that is quite interesting. You can have a look at it online. It was led by two deputies, Antoine Lenormand and Ludovic Mendes. And it's a report on production, and the title is From Production to Consumption for a Global Policy Against Drug Trafficking. So what's interesting is that there's this observation that you have mentioned as well, and actually it's quite dramatic because now it's in written, and at the same time we ignore this kind of observation because there are some legal measures that are only based on repression. So the observation by Leonel Mendes is the colossal development of traffic in the territory in areas where there had been no trafficking in the past, especially in rural areas. I mean, there is now no point in France where you cannot get whatever you want in terms of drugs. I mean, there are global dealers that can supply you with everything you want. And this is organized as criminal mafias with lots of conflicts and violence. So this leads us to the conclusion that all policies have totally failed so far. And actually, the functioning of these criminal organizations is the same as that of legal corporation, with the chart, with the hierarchy, with technologies, with fight against competition. So this makes us think that we're going to destabilize absolutely everything. And corruption is there, and we agree with the figures that you mentioned, and these figures have been revealed in the work that we have carried out. And we saw as well that the policy of repression, of 100% repression, to really punish the smallest consumer and dealer to the highest top of the mafia, is the same policy, which means that there is no difference. It's repression for all, regardless of the level in the hierarchy of drug trafficking. So if I may, I'd like to say, I don't know if you're interested in that, but there are some measures of this drug trafficking law. These are intrusive measures. It's about giving power to the judicial police. It's about setting a national team against organized crime, and of course providing resources to justice, to police, to fight against laundering, because this is one of the consequences. And this is also about providing the préfet with the power, with the competence of imposing some administrative measures. So it's about a series of measures, and we will see if the effects are effective or not. I have my doubts personally, but anyway, this responds to the social requests in France. And there's also a report that goes by Mendes that goes against this, and actually, well, his group represents different political orientations, and they have observed that, well, drugs, 90% of drugs arrive via the ports. So if you want to fight against corruption, you need to go there, you need to scan ships, and you need to scan ports, you need to train the staff at the customs. And there's also the need, and the report says so, the need to stop stigmatizing consumers, and the need to really reverse the discourse, to prioritize harm reduction, prioritize as well prevention, and provide means, which was the case years ago. I think that we have gone backwards because now I don't see in public policies, I don't see the work that had been done in past years for smoking, for example, with a lot of success, and with alcohol with some success. Now here, regarding drug trafficking, I don't see any work being done in terms of prevention, in terms of harm reduction. And I think that we cannot carry out coherent public policies because in Europe every country is developing their own policies. So it's totally impossible. I mean, whenever a country like France takes these provisions, well, they're contrary to what has been voted in Spain, they're contrary to what is voted in Portugal, where there's this idea of reconsidering consumption. And well, this is a very painful debate. It's a debate also that leads to more gaps and more breaches. And I'm sure as well that it's going to be part of the election on 2027, but I don't think that the French society is ready for this, even though we have been carrying out a lot of parliamentary work. And we know that we need to reorient our public policies, and we need to have an influence as well in the policy of towns. We need to put in place proximity policies. And today, you see the importance of internet and platforms, and these platforms are acting in total impunity, and they're not being prosecuted, and they sell products, and they're not taking their responsibilities. And I think we're far away also from the Italian model when it comes to repentance and the status of repentance. But anyway, to conclude about what you were saying, the parliamentary work to which I'm referring shows that France will have to organize a participatory process around the framework around cannabis, and we need to find a model of regulation. And this is the conclusion of the report. And it says as well that we could be inspired by the Portuguese reform and depenalize the use of narcotics, and to start ambitious policies for prevention and legalize use of cannabis for personal purposes, because I think that this affects hundreds of thousands of people. So this is where we are at the National Assembly. This is the work of the legislator. And well, it's actually about responding to the demands of the Ministry of Health and the Ministry of Justice, who want to stick to the repressive policies. And they want to insist in this repression, even though they know that it does not work. It is a complete failure. And we know, and it has been documented. I mean, we have been working on this and at different levels. We know that it does not work, and we know that we need to change the perspective, and we know that society, at least the French society, is not ready for this. And whenever we want to start this debate, it really triggers a lot of passion, and not in a good way. And some people think they are wise, but they are not. And those who know what they're saying, they cannot talk freely. All right. I think that, yeah, lots of people will join to what you have said. And it's true that, unfortunately, we're moving towards passion rather than towards reason. And when we forget about reason, well, there's this risk. We could invite to this debate representatives of the media, because media are the bridge between public opinion and well, we see that parliamentaries, deputies, well, there are different ideas, but we see that there are also many common ideas. But then we need to get the attention of the public opinion. And so the debate is open. Patrick, thank you very much for this intervention. It's interesting that the parliament is interested in the matter. You know, it's been 35 years since we said that we need to depenalize cannabis, and they say that let's go for it. And today the police is saying we're going to arrest you, we're going to arrest them. And what is the police doing? Well, most of what the police is doing is against cannabis, maybe a little bit more against cocaine, but police is today devoted to this. And actually, if we have legalized, if we have depenalized 20 years ago, we wouldn't have such a developed and mature network and powerful network. But it is true that it is easier. You know, we're very much limited, and the law against drug trafficking prevents us from opening the encrypted messages. So this means that most dealers, they use encrypted messages, and they have extraordinary media, extraordinary means actually. And with their eavesdroppers, there's no way to fight against this kind of traffic. And also have a look at the local press. And yes, it's true that, well, we confiscate 100 grams of cannabis here and there, but really, and on cocaine, there is so much cocaine everywhere, and it's so complicated. I have discussed with the Préfet in Bayonne and with people in charge, with police officers, that say that they are so mobilized around security. They know that there are eavesdroppers. They know that there are people that are supplying all parties in Bayonne with cocaine, and we cannot do anything about it. So we know that big amounts are coming up of cocaine, like kilograms of cocaine, and you will tell me that the prices have lowered down. And some colleagues tell me that you can find 1 gram at 15 to 20 euros. In the past, it was 60 euros. So this is a problem. It's a problem. And therefore, you know, we are trying to do things, but without effectiveness. And we cannot go upstream and find who is in charge of the networks. We cannot do our investigation. And there's the same problem with pedophilia, with online pedophilia. I mean, we are talking of levels of organization. I mean, we're talking about high-level criminals, and they're very organized, so it's very difficult to stop that in spite of the willingness. I mean, there are two centers that have been created. I have visited certain prisons where you have those big drug dealers and they cannot communicate amongst each other. And they're in prison, but they still remain in business. And actually, they have more time to do that. They're in prison, so they just keep business as usual. So we are in this situation. And the provisions that have been taken in the legislation are really minor to tackle the problem. And now in the audience, is there any reaction? Maybe for some brief answers, brief interventions.
Hello, thank you for this debate, these presentations. I was wondering about motivations for people to use cocaine. They are not always party related. I have some patients who take cocaine to end their job in the fields for the harvest, and sometimes some places somewhere there are even children who consume to cut the because they are hungry. Well, many responses, but we don't know any society without drugs. In the Phoenicians in the Middle Ages, well before the use of vegetal drugs is as old as the world. So, well, what you are mentioning is prevention. The politics of the city, which is a major problem. It is not that simple, of course, but we could say that something that they are.
Il est important de s'en inspirer. Il y a un autre aspect, et je voulais interroger peut-être Sophie Massin là-dessus. Lors du dernier colloque, Christian Bedlaglar nous avait expliqué que le narcotrafic du cannabis était pyramidal, et donc que le haut de la pyramide n'était pas en France. C'était un cartel, disons, maroco, hispano, et qu'il était à Dubaï. Et j'ai lu récemment que ce cartel, ça rapprocherait de notre cartel mexicain pour s'attaquer donc au marché de la cocaïne en France. Est-ce que vous avez des données là-dessus?
Pas spécialement, c'est pas une thématique sur laquelle je travaille particulièrement. Les informations dont on a discuté avec Christian, c'est qu'effectivement, il y a probablement des sortes d'ententes entre producteurs sur le marché de la cocaïne pour faire baisser le prix très rapidement. Et ça s'observe déjà en France. Je crois qu'il y a des remontées de terrain qui montrent que ça a chuté vraiment de façon très forte à certains endroits. Donc, on retrouve, c'est des mécanismes économiques, encore une fois, généraux, qu'on retrouve aussi sur des marchés légaux où on est avec des oligopoles, avec quelques gros producteurs qui ont intérêt à trouver des ententes pour adopter la meilleure politique tarifaire. Donc c'est à la fois peu surprenant que ça se passe comme ça et très inquiétant pour les conséquences pour le prochain.
Parce que, et ça confirme ce que disait CAPDEVIELLE, c'est qu'ils importent leur politique commerciale en s'intéressant aux plus jeunes. On sait que plus tôt on expérimente une substance récompensante, plus nombreux seront les addicts. On devient beaucoup plus facilement addict à 14 ans qu'à 25 ans. Et donc, on s'adresse à eux. Et en même temps, on amène aussi la violence. Et on voit la violence. Nous, on la voit même ici aux Pays-Bas. On n'avait pas... le narcotrafic n'était pas quand même très violent. Il y a eu une histoire de temps en temps. Là, maintenant, c'est régulier. Et donc, on voit mal comment... Un autre aspect, c'est que nous qui travaillons donc dans les centres de soins d'addictologie, eh bien, on est de plus en plus concernés, accaparés, bousculés par l'urgence et la difficulté de prise en charge des addicts au crack et à la cocaïne. Et ils monopolisent beaucoup plus de temps de soignants et de soins que... et donc, ça va faire défaut aussi aux autres addictions, puisqu'on doit consacrer une telle urgence au problème de la cocaïne. Question ?
J'avais une première question plus politique pour savoir comment on évaluait le désir d'une société, puisque vous avez à 2 fois dit que la société française n'était pas prête à un changement, et je pense que c'est peut-être pas si facile à évaluer, surtout en s'inspirant du modèle canadien qui a été effectivement un débat très passionnel avant de le faire, et quand ils l'ont fait, finalement, ça s'est arrêté, les débats, et plus personne ne veut revenir en arrière. Donc, est-ce que de temps en temps, les politiques regardent aussi ce qui se passe à l'étranger pour s'en inspirer ? C'était ma question. Et du coup, pour aller là-dessus par rapport à Ivana, est-ce qu'on a un recul sur le Canada, notamment, par rapport à un report, justement, des marchés illicites sur la question de la cocaïne? Est-ce qu'il y a eu un impact sur la question de la violence, justement, par rapport à ce qui se passe, ce qu'on voit émerger chez nous? Est-ce que, du coup, il y a eu des choses un peu différentes dans les pays qui ont, justement, légalisé, dépénalisé? Est-ce qu'on a un peu une idée là-dessus ou pas du tout? Merci.
Oui, ce travail a été fait en France, bien sûr, hein, mais quand je dis que à l'heure actuelle, je vous parle en 2025, je pense que au moment où je vous parle, quand la question s'est posée, pardon, mais Monsieur Retailleau, ministre de l'Intérieur, n'y était pas prêt, pas plus que Gérald Darmanin, pas plus que le chef de l'État. Enfin, quand on a posé ces questions. Voilà, maintenant, tant que c'est pas dans le débat public, tant qu'on n'en parle pas, tant que les médias ne posent pas le sujet, que c'est bien parce que vous faites un colloque ouvert au public, il faut que le grand public, ce qu'on n'appelle pas les spécialistes sont tous convaincus, donc on va tous s'auto-convaincre entre nous, c'est formidable, c'est merveilleux, mais c'est pas le plus important, c'est aller porter cette parole dans le grand public, donc avec tous les moyens modernes maintenant, c'est-à-dire les réseaux sociaux, les médias, vous-même, tous les spécialistes, allez parler sur les plateaux, allez expliquer, faire des études comparatives avec ce qui se passe dans les autres pays. Mais bien évidemment, j'espère qu'il y aura des candidats à la présidentielle en 2027 qui mettront cette question dans le débat, parce qu'il faudra l'avoir à un moment donné. Pas forcément. C'est la dernière chose. On a toujours fait ça. En particulier, M. Jospin était totalement opposé alors qu'il a perdu les élections. Et qu'il reconnaissait.
Non, je dis que c'est une excuse qu'on a toujours, c'est-à-dire on ne va pas être élu. Et M. Jospin avait décidé de ne pas poser le problème à l'élection présidentielle parce qu'il pensait que ça l'empêcherait d'être élu. Voilà. Et ça ne l'a pas empêché, il n'a pas été élu et il n'a pas proposé. Donc c'est vrai qu'on a peur. Les politiques ont peur, c'est pas parce qu'on fait un rapport qu'on va vouloir changer la politique et surtout changer la relation à une drogue qui est largement utilisée en France par des enfants jeunes, au lycée, c'est devenu une habitude et on ne fait rien. C'est-à-dire que la police dit on arrête les gens, on est de plus en plus débordés, etc. On aurait dû légaliser et s'occuper des autres drogues. À ce moment-là, je pense que les réseaux auraient été. C'est trop tard, on ne l'a pas fait, donc on va continuer à faire ça. Et des actions médiatiques, on en a fait chaque fois, à chaque élection, etc. Oh, si. Bien sûr, on a interpellé les politiques, on leur a demandé, et chaque fois, avant les élections, on ne va pas être élu.
Ah, oui, non, juste avant de passer la parole, non, Patrick, c'est que, parce que tu as oublié ce que tu as fait. Bernard Kouchner, qui devait être là, et qui a été retenu, Patrick vous expliquera éventuellement pourquoi, et qui est d'habitué de ce congrès, et donc, à l'époque, avait commencé par faire ce qui était raisonnable. Il avait chargé quelqu'un qui est un habitué aussi de ce colloque le professeur Bernard Roch, membre de l'Académie des sciences, qui avait réuni un panel d'experts et il avait produit un rapport sur la dangerosité des drogues. Il avait classé, on voyait bien que le cannabis n'était pas dans ce qui était le plus dangereux. Et évidemment, ce rapport avait été taxé, alors qu'il y avait une vingtaine d'experts, d'ailleurs, des gens tout à fait éminents, Raphaël Maldonado et d'autres qui étaient aussi d'autres pays, mais qui étaient de très bons experts. Et on avait dit, ben voilà, c'est un rapport pour KOUCHNER, c'est un rapport de gauche. Et donc, quelques temps après, un très brillant, aussi, un éminent neuroscientifique anglais, David Nutt, de l'Imperial College, a fait aussi un rapport en ce sens. Et sur un plateau de télévision, il avait eu le malheur de dire « Oui, le cannabis est moins dangereux que de monter à cheval ». Alors il a été comme on dit en anglais, il a été limogé de ses fonctions officielles un petit peu. Donc nous, notre tentative, notre volonté, c'est qu'il y ait dans ce congrès, donc qui est un congrès scientifique, mais c'est de tenter, autant que faire se peut, d'introduire la parole scientifique. La science, attention, la science n'est pas les mathématiques et la physique nucléaire. La science, c'est l'approche rationnelle des phénomènes. Et les sciences sociales sont bien entendu des sciences aussi. Ce n'est pas que les sciences dures. D'ailleurs, je crois que le professeur Bocart, qui est par là, avait mis en épigraphe de son livre cette citation, je crois, de Montesquieu. La science, c'est une ignorance qui se sait. Mais bon, donc c'est de l'approche rationnelle. Et il y a dans notre pays quand même un défaut. On n'arrive pas à faire passer une connaissance, enfin, ce que l'on sait, en tout cas, du point de vue de la science, là où il y a des très bons niveaux de preuves, on n'arrive pas à faire passer ce problème. Et quand on voit, en effet, non seulement le coût social aussi de l'alcool et du tabac, 70 000 morts, alors, je ne savais pas que le coût était aussi extravagant, mais 70 000 morts, on dit l'alcool 60 000 à peu près. Voilà. Et par ailleurs, on ne peut pas avoir... Mais la drogue reste approchée de façon passionnelle et c'est immédiatement du laxisme. Et donc, nous, notre credo, c'est de dire, écoute, on va produire des données scientifiques, dire ce que l'on sait, ce que l'on ne sait pas, et essayer d'être aussi pragmatique que possible. Des mains se lèvent là-bas.
Oui.
Oui. Donc, Ivana a été interrogée, elle répond, et ensuite, monsieur.
Oui, pour répondre à la question du report, c'est toujours une question difficile de savoir si une réforme articulée, centrée sur un produit, a des effets de report vers d'autres consommations. Si c'était le cas au Canada, c'est pas forcément vers la cocaïne, c'est plutôt les opioïdes de synthèse, le sujet, comme aux États-Unis d'ailleurs. Mais cette question du report, elle est intéressante, par exemple, à propos du cas de l'Uruguay. C'est-à-dire que depuis quelques années, la réforme de légalisation du cannabis est attaquée parce qu'il y a eu une hausse des homicides liés aux drogues et de la violence liée au trafic, mais qui est en fait le fait de la cocaïne plus que du cannabis. Donc c'est vraiment le sujet montant, la cocaïne et les drogues de synthèse. Et c'est vrai qu'on parlait de la tonalité du débat public en France autour d'une réforme du cannabis. Ce qui est frappant, c'est cette focalisation sur la figure du jeune, mais qui en fait n'est plus tellement d'actualité, puisque, comme je le disais en introduction, depuis 10 ans, la consommation de cannabis baisse drastiquement chez les mineurs. Alors évidemment, ça reste le produit stupéfiant le plus consommé en France et en Europe, mais il y a un renouvellement générationnel de la consommation de ce produit qui s'est clairement ralenti. En revanche, la cocaïne, bah voilà, on est à un niveau de production mondiale au-delà de 3000 tonnes par an. C'est 3 fois plus que dans la décennie précédente. On a des prix qui baissent pour la première fois en France. Le prix du gramme, le prix moyen du gramme de cocaïne est passé sous la barre des 60 €, sachant que, évidemment, les trafiquants développent des stratégies de vente pour élargir leur clientèle, par exemple le fractionnement. Donc on peut avoir de la cocaïne pour 10 €, par exemple, ça ne sera pas 1 gramme, ça sera moins. Mais ça permet aussi de s'adresser à des publics plus précaires, à des publics éventuellement plus jeunes. On ne le voit pas encore dans les chiffres de consommation, mais il y a des stratégies d'adaptation. Et effectivement, le fait que cette offre soit si abondante, qu'elle inonde le marché et qu'elle aille sans doute très au-delà de la demande, ça crée de la violence puisqu'il y a une concurrence entre les réseaux de trafic qui ont tendance à baisser les prix et à se faire concurrence avec de la violence, des conflits armés même. Voilà. Donc finalement, la question du report, c'est moins sur les consommations que sur les dynamiques du trafic qu'on peut un peu la documenter aujourd'hui.
Oui, ce qui est sûr, c'est que la guerre à la drogue est devant un échec énorme. Et alors que d'autres pays réfléchissent effectivement à d'autres alternatives, en France, on reste complètement bloqué. Je me souviens de la déclaration de Darmanin quand il était ministre de l'Intérieur à propos d'une fusillade, je crois que c'était à Nîmes, qui avait fait donc des victimes collatérales. Et il dit, oui, évidemment, c'est parce qu'on a démantelé un réseau qu'il y a deux autres réseaux qui se battent pour la place. Mais alors, monsieur Darmanin, si votre action provoque plus de violence encore que si vous n'aviez rien fait, il faut quand même se poser la question de l'utilité de ce genre d'action et de ce genre de... C'est donc effectivement vider la mer avec une petite cuillère, c'est la police des stupéfiants dans les réunions que j'ai pu faire en tant qu'interprète d'Europol et compagnie, c'est leur expression favorite. On arrive là à un constat d'échec patent que la Global Commission dénonce depuis des années, hein, et qui rassemble la Global Commission on Drugs. Je vous rappelle que c'est quand même des gens qui étaient aux manettes, et y compris des fois ce qu'on appelle des tsars de la lutte contre la drogue, contre les drogues. Mais donc là, il y a un constat d'échec patent, et il faudrait quand même qu'en France, que le débat s'ouvre. Le problème, c'est vrai, les médias ont une responsabilité, parce que même des journaux qui pourtant fouillent leur sujet très bien pour dénoncer les situations, je pense à des journaux comme Le Monde, etc., ils font des articles très intéressants, ils s'arrêtent au constat du narcotrafic, etc., et de ses méfaits, mais ils ne poussent jamais la réflexion de se dire, bon, alors d'accord, on a cette situation, on sait que la prohibition, comme ça a été le cas pour l'alcool, a fourni, c'est ce qui a renforcé la mafia italo-américaine à cette époque qui était très faible, et grâce à la prohibition, elle a pu engranger un pouvoir énorme de corruption et d'argent, et qui ensuite s'est reconverti dans le trafic de drogue, etc. Et il faudrait quand même s'interroger, se dire maintenant la prohibition qui a, comme le disait tout à l'heure, c'est trop tard, oui c'est trop tard, et de toute façon il est toujours quand même possible d'aller outre cette tendance, et la seule façon de casser les reins aux narcos, c'est justement la légalisation, mais la légalisation de toutes les drogues, pas uniquement le cannabis. Il faudra réfléchir effectivement de la manière dans laquelle cette légalisation, en tout cas déjà cette dépénalisation de l'usage, ça c'est sûr, et cette légalisation aussi, parce que c'est la seule façon dont on a maintenant la possibilité de casser des mafias qui sont devenues tentaculaires, avec un pouvoir de corruption sur les juges, sur tout l'appareil d'État. L'appareil d'État s'en inquiète même de toute façon à tous les niveaux, des procureurs, etc. Mais justement, toute cette situation très inquiétante, cette violence, on peut constater quand même que dans les cités françaises, il y a une violence énorme qui n'existe pas en Espagne ou au Portugal. Je suis désolé, il y a du trafic dans ces pays, bien évidemment, mais on n'est pas arrivé au niveau, donc il faut s'interroger de la France au niveau de la violence. Il y a pas des fusillades, même dans les bidonvilles gitans de Madrid. Il y a de temps en temps des règlements de compte entre familles gitanes, mais enfin, c'est jamais, ça n'atteint pas du tout le sommet. Et quant aux solutions de cette super prison, combien de temps va durer l'anonymat des fonctionnaires qui vont être employés dans cette prison et contre lesquels bientôt les familles mafieuses vont exercer des pressions dès qu'ils connaîtront leur identité. C'est pas compliqué, il suffit de se mettre à la sortie de la prison et voir les gens qui en sortent. Ils mettront pas longtemps à identifier tout le personnel de la prison et exercer des pressions sur eux. Donc moi je n'y crois pas à ces super prisons, à moins d'atteinte totale aux droits de l'homme, comme c'est effectivement un peu la direction qui est prise. Enfin voilà, tant que le débat n'est pas posé, et la loi de 70, je rappelle, interdit de la présentation d'un jour favorable. Et rien que cette disposition de la loi de 70 qui continue à nous faire du mal, nous empêche en plus d'ouvrir le débat.
Oui, mais reste le problème que nous sommes en démocratie et que c'est l'électeur qui a la clé. Et donc, nous, pour ce qui nous concerne, c'est de donner de l'information, s'abstenir au maximum, donner des opinions, mais des informations, et qui permettent de prendre des décisions plus éclairées. Mais il faut en effet, alors comment y participer, mais qui est un grand débat. Là maintenant, oui, Bertrand, bien sûr, le narcotrafic maintenant nous impose ce débat. C'est quand même très récent. Là, la violence, l'inondation de cocaïne problématique, de crack, etc., fait que là, on ne peut plus l'éviter, ce débat. Et je ne sais pas comment éviter qu'il ne soit trop passionnel et aux mains des populistes.
Pour moi, ça a à voir avec un exercice réel et sincère de démocratie, de participation. On a perdu dans beaucoup de notre société la capacité d'activer ce type de débat profond, complet, et avec tous les éléments, tous les acteurs sociaux dans le débat pour moi. Et il y a des questions basiques qu'on n'est pas en train de nous faire. Pourquoi est-ce que la France, l'Espagne et d'autres pays sont en train de consommer comme on consomme? Qu'est-ce qui se passe? Qu'est-ce qui nous passe? Qu'est-ce qu'il y a dedans dans ces problèmes complexes, dans des contextes, dans des cultures qui sont là, qu'il faut adresser et qu'on adresse seulement par la répression, par les prohibitions. Et ça c'est un problème parce qu'on a laissé la réponse. J'ai dit toujours que c'est un exercice d'irresponsabilité partagée. Irresponsabilité partagée. On a laissé les recettes, la réponse plutôt, et on voit au niveau des budgets, on voit au niveau des moyens humains, au dur. C'est le ministère de l'Intérieur, c'est le ministère de la Justice, ce sont les prisons qui ont la plus grande partie de la réponse. Et ça, c'est à la fin les résultats qu'on va voir, parce qu'on a dans une cadre de prohibition, et l'offre va toujours être là, toujours, n'importe de quel type on engrosse la réponse répressive. Et pour moi, il y a une autre chose qui est importante, et c'est aussi un exercice de démocratie, c'est il faut rendre compte. Et on a dit tous ici, c'est un échec complet du cadre classique de lutte contre les drogues. Et même si on prohibit et on doit lutter contre les pouvoirs du crime organisé, il faut aller après l'argent. Et dans ces luttes contre le blanchiment, c'est ridicule. Même l'idée d'une agence européenne de blanchiment, qui à la fin a déjà été accordée, appliquée, ça n'a pas commencé Et on a des machines à laver, à blanchir chez notre porte, dans beaucoup de paradis fiscaux. Et ça, n'a changé. Alors, ce n'est pas seulement les crimes organisés qui blanchissent. Ce sont les gens qui évadent l'impôt, les corrupteurs, etc. Et ça, c'est le pouvoir qui est derrière. Et on doit lutter contre ces incentives. Pour nous, c'est un mouvement urgent. C'est pour ça qu'on est en train de mettre en plateforme d'innovation sociale pour, des fois, générer l'enthousiasme des gens qui veulent changer ce type de cadre, parce qu'à la fin, les débats est un débat complètement aveugle. Aveugle parce que quand on évalue les politiques, et on a ici une personne qui est dans l'organisation qui voit comment les phénomènes de drogue se déroulent dans les pays, et on ne voit pas toute la photo. L'effet sur le développement, l'effet sur les droits humains. Et on a eu des développements au niveau international avec des exécutions extrajudiciaires. Je n'ai pas écouté aucune réaction des gouvernements européens en train de dire c'est au feu. Et j'ai écouté la semaine passée et j'appuie ce type de déclaration et une plainte contre l'utilisation de la peine de mort pour des délits de drogue, parce qu'il y a un élément là des droits humains clair, mais l'impact que notre coopération internationale, par exemple, a par rapport à mort, à incarcérés, etc., est beaucoup plus grand que des pays qui appliquent la peine de mort. Et on ne dit rien. Et on ne dit rien parce qu'à la fin, même les fonds de coopération internationale pour le développement sont toujours utilisés pour la coopération policière, pour la coopération judiciaire, et pas pour ouvrir une réflexion plus profonde avec tous les éléments de développement. On a dans ces domaines-là, pour moi, beaucoup d'absence des acteurs de développement, de la culture, de l'art et de l'éducation, et qui doivent être les protagonistes de cette politique. Pas l'intérieur, pas la justice, qui aussi ont des choses à dire, mais pour moi, c'est un débat complètement incomplet. C'est ça, et je crois qu'au niveau comment est-ce qu'on dit, fortalecer, renforcer la démocratie dans nos pays, c'est très important, c'est un débat important. Et comme des politiciens, on a peur à l'impact électoral et on a besoin d'une génération de politiciens valientes, bravos, vraiment pour prendre ces problèmes et pas pour ajouter de l'huile au feu. Et ce qu'on voit, c'est plus de même, plus de recettes répressives, plus de scanners au port. À la fin, ça n'arrête rien. Ça, c'est le problème. Ça, c'est le problème. Ce sont des opportunités aussi pour la corruption. Quand les drogues passent, ça s'étend. Ça, c'est un peu l'expérience aussi de la guerre contre la drogue. Et pour moi, c'est pour ça que je l'appelle, c'est une question d'un travail décisif impossible.
Il s'avère, Hegel, le philosophe Hegel, disait que la lecture du journal est la prière de l'homme moderne. Alors moi, c'est un quotidien vespéral que je lis, et au mois de janvier dernier, j'ai vu le gros titre du Monde concernant le rapport que vous évoquiez, le rapport, je crois, Léaumont ou Léaumont. Voilà. Et alors, qu'est-ce qui avait marqué en gros? D'ailleurs, ça m'a beaucoup surpris, j'ai gardé la page, je l'ai même utilisé dans un article, mais qui ne va pas paraître tout de suite. En gros, il disait, en dehors de la légalisation, il n'y a pas de solution. On va penser que je suis obsédé et donc j'oublie cette histoire de légalisation et je pense que pour mes 100 ans, dans 25 ans, la cocaïne sera légalisée. Maintenant, je voudrais parler d'ici et maintenant. Tout à l'heure, j'étais à une session sur l'analyse des drogues. Et dans la discussion, j'ai appris qu'à Barcelone, il y a 50 salles de consommation. Non seulement il y a 50 salles de consommation, mais alors je ne peux pas affirmer que dans les 50 c'est le cas, mais dans un certain nombre d'entre elles, on peut faire de l'analyse de substances. En France, comme vous le savez, il y a 2 salles de consommation qu'on appelle maintenant halte soins addiction, ce qui fait qu'on, peu importe, à Paris et à Strasbourg. Toutes les autres ont été bloquées. Parce que c'est vrai que la RDR en France, ça vient, ça va. Il y a des périodes qui sont fastes et d'autres qui sont néfastes. On est clairement dans une période néfaste. Et j'ai terminé dans quelques secondes. Moi, ce que j'aimerais, c'est... Comment s'appelle l'agence européenne maintenant? D'accord, l'agence européenne des drogues fasse la chose suivante. Qu'elle choisisse les meilleures pratiques en matière de réduction des risques en Europe. Ah, là, ce truc espagnol où on croise des salles de consommation avec de l'analyse de substances.
Substance analysis is good to take. It's a good idea. And we could take here, this, there, and this is for today. This would be extremely pragmatic, and it would be, at least, it's the wish that I'd like to formulate. Thank you very much. Very well. Do we have a last question? I have a question, but it's not really a question. It's rather an observation for Madam the Deputy or MP. I'm a school teacher, and I work in a neighborhood where there are many families that are on the territory illegally, and they live from this drug trafficking. What will happen to these people? It's very complicated for these. Sometimes they have 6, 7, 8, 14 children, and they're holding the schools. So what is happening when things will be legalized? What will they live from? I was in a situation recently, and it's not the first time, when we have families who ended up prostituting their children. When you discover a child, a young girl that is prostituted, imagine. It's awful. So just an observation, what were we going to offer these families who are here illegally on our territory? And where would they go? We need to think about this because the Republican school, unfortunately, doesn't offer anything to children or to the families, in fact. There was just a comment. Well, since I will answer. In fact, I think we need to make their situation more regular. People contact us every day. It's a period that is not an easy one, not a simple one, but for the families who have settled here with children, they need to become regular. I mean, their situation needs to become regular. And I reassure you, these deal points are not held by people who are in an irregular situation. These points of deal and suppliers of these different drugs are not foreign people in an irregular situation. So there are much more people working irregularly, but it is false to think that these are foreigners in an illegal situation who come and sell drugs in France. That is wrong. The networks are very, very well organized, and we cannot say that it's just such and such category of people. If you assert this, there is no base of documentation or legal basis to be able to assert this. So this is an observation in one place, but it's not a way to generalize it for everywhere. Many drugs are sold on the internet today. You know, most consumers now are supplied. It's the famous Uber drugs. Uber drugs, the pizza delivery guy who also delivers products ordered on the internet. This person is a French person with papers. An ID. The documents I mentioned before and talked about a fair transition of the illicit market and the legal market. And we recognize that there is a popular economy linked to drugs in many countries. And what we need when we need to fight these situations, to regulate. And in the city of New York, they are committed, and former dealers they're hired rather as participants in the selling of cannabis. So we need to try to do things. These are new markets, and it's an opportunity, a fantastic opportunity for inclusion, economy, and social inclusion of these people who are outside of the system. So this is something we need to take into account. There have been tests of this type in the Paris region. A judge for children who had worked on this and considered when you're a young minor capable of organizing a drug trafficking, then she said, I won't put him in jail, I won't punish him, but I will put him in contact with an employer who will use the person's intelligence to do something else. And at the time, she was a judge who was at the forefront of these issues, and it worked very well because indeed these young people could do things elsewhere, and because they were helped by people who knew where they come from and would hire them, and they know these were highly intelligent and they can use their intelligence to do something else, to work in a different way, and especially in trade. And this was supported by the famous chef Thierry Marx, who has young kids in his kitchen working with him, and Luc Besson also took part in this program, and he had a lot of young people that he helped work in cinema. So they helped a number of these dealer young kids, and they took them out from this illicit market to change their future. So this is not what is happening currently, not at all. Yes, so time is running out. It's time to close our discussion. What we could say is that if we just look at the medical model, it is important before envisaging a treatment to have a diagnosis, and this approach is absolutely unavoidable. The diagnosis. We have diseases that have been incurable for many years, and now we can cure them. We have a cure. So we all search for solutions. There's no miracle solution, but the observation is that when you collect symptoms, you look at them, and with the diagnosis, currently, having the knowledge of the power of the economic impact of narco-trafficking, which, as you mentioned, I think you all mentioned it, not enough to my point of view. It's the power of corruption with money, money that corrupts. And there is no example or of very important financial power that is not able to convince and corrupt. You can corrupt financially. It is a great danger in order to find efficient solutions, and it's a danger to democracies. Democracies, Latin American democracies, just to mention them, but you can look on the eastern side also, or there are other, well, these democracies are gangrened in their democratic ways of working, and we shouldn't be too exposed. This exposure to, and we're not shielded against it. We have no protection against it. We need to collect knowledge, warn, provide information to the population, and then it's through this awareness of the population in a democratic country that we can hope having a momentum to find solutions, efficient solutions that are democratic. In any case, even radical solutions in a democracy, we saw, let's look at the case of the Philippines. There was a massacre of a lot of drug addicts. That's what the president did a few years ago. And drug keeps circulating. Addictions haven't disappeared through what Duarte did in the Philippines. So let's keep our democracy and let's remain watchful, informed, vigilant, and intelligent if possible. There is an estimate by 10 years ago by the Italian government. He said that the gangreta for cocaine, the imports of cocaine annually, this was 60,000 million of euros. What kind of democracy or political party or judicial system can face these power, such a big, important power when it comes to funding political parties, the reality in the territories? It's awful. And we're not talking about weak governance, we're talking about strong governments. And at the same time, we are selling the fight against mafia to Latin America. And the European cooperation, it's awful because in the end, it's about adding problems. And I think that there is an emergency, and especially in our times, we see in the United States and countries like El Salvador, Ecuador, Argentina, other Central American countries who are, we see what's happening in these countries. They try to set up models that are more and more repressive because that's what's happening. People are tired of insecurity, being used by all these repressive systems. And it's for drug policies, it's essential in order to consolidate peace in many communities on both sides of the Atlantic. For me, it's an urgent element, and especially at times when fascism or extreme right or other extreme positions are moving forward. Maybe that will be our conclusion. Let's meet again in 2 years, and we will have found solutions. Thank you very much to all the different speakers for having given time and information.
Recording